From the outside, addiction may appear simple: a failure of willpower, a reckless choice, a behavior that, if only one tried hard enough, should be controllable. But this view is not just shallow, it is profoundly wrong. Carl Jung, that quiet cartographer of the human soul, saw addiction not as a defect of morality, but as a cry for help, a spiritual wound masked as compulsion. Beneath every addiction, he believed, lies a story untold: an ache, an absence, a painful disconnection between who we are and who we were meant to become. Jung did not see the addict as weak. He saw them as lost, disconnected from the vital center of their being, that place within where meaning, purpose, and direction reside. In words often attributed to him, no addict heals unless they have a spiritual experience. This points to a deeper truth. The substance, the behavior, the craving, it is not the root problem. It is a symbol, a placeholder for something sacred that's missing. What the addict seeks isn't the drug or the drink or the escape. What they seek is transcendence, wholeness, a felt sense of belonging in the universe. But most don't know that. They only feel the ache, a gnawing anxiety, a sense of incompleteness that has no name. To silence that ache, they reach for something, anything, that promises relief: alcohol, drugs, sex, food, technology. Not because they desire those things, but because those things offer a momentary silence, a fleeting relief. But relief is not healing, and so the ache returns, stronger, heavier, more desperate, and the cycle deepens. Because the more one tries to fill an inner void with something external, the more disconnected they become from the source of their true suffering. For Jung, addiction was not a disease of the body, but a hunger of the soul, a hunger for truth, for authenticity, for meaning. Addiction is the unconscious whispering, crying out for connection, not to another high, but to the self, to something eternal. In ancient cultures, substances were not used to escape life, but to enter more deeply into it. Used in ritual, in reverence, as a bridge to the divine, not to numb reality, but to awaken to it. Today, in a world stripped of the sacred and starved of the symbolic, those same substances once used in ritual are now consumed blindly, without reverence, without direction. As if, deep beneath the surface, the individual were still trying to touch the divine, trying to recreate an experience of transcendence that modern life has quietly stolen. But without myth, without meaning, without the inner compass that once guided the soul, that search turns into a fall. The substance no longer opens the door to the eternal. It shatters the self. Carl Jung knew that reason alone cannot sustain a human life. We are not machines. We are meaning makers. And we need myths. We need images. We need symbols that speak to the deep waters of the unconscious. When these vanish, or when they are reduced to hollow cliches, the soul begins to decay. And when the soul is in pain, it searches for healing wherever it can, even in the shadows. In this light, addiction becomes something more than a vice. It becomes a misdirected quest, a broken but sincere attempt to mend what was torn. This is why Jung's ideas were so influential in the early formation of Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill Wilson, the founder, was moved by a letter Jung wrote, a letter in which Jung described addiction not as a moral failure, but as a spiritual thirst, a longing for transformation, for rebirth. Recovery, Jung believed, was not about willpower. It was not about punishment or rigid discipline. It was about the emergence of something new within, a deeper sense of meaning, a reconnection to the lost center of the self. Addiction, then, is not merely a disorder. It is a message, a signal from the soul that something essential has been forgotten. And like all crises, it carries within it the seed of opportunity, the chance to turn inward, to face the darkness, and to begin the long journey home. Jung didn't speak of curing the addict in the medical sense. He spoke of helping them find what they had been searching for in all the wrong places. The true task is not simply abstinence, it is self-reclamation. The addict's pain, however raw, however consuming, reveals something vital. That within them, beneath the despair, there still burns a longing for the real, for truth, for wholeness. Even if that longing is buried under shame, confusion, and fear, it is still alive. And that spark, that small ember of hope, is what makes transformation possible. Because people are not changed by guilt, they are changed by meaning. And meaning often only emerges when one has fallen to the bottom and can finally look up from the depths and begin to see with new eyes. Many who suffer describe a hollow feeling, an emptiness they cannot name, as if something vital is missing, even if they can't say what. But Jung knew, what's missing is not a substance. What's missing is the self. Jung understood that what the addict seeks is not the substance itself, but the wholeness it symbolizes. The real longing is for the totality of the psyche, for the integration of all that has been cast into shadow, the forgotten, the rejected, the repressed. Beneath every addiction lies a yearning, a longing for comfort, for power, for love, for a sense of belonging, for redemption, not in the outer world, but in the self. At the core, the addict is searching for a lost part of themselves, a piece broken off by pain, by trauma, by years of silent suffering. This is where Jung's vision becomes clear. Addiction is not just behavior, it is symbol. In the language of the psyche, symptoms are not errors. They are messages, cries from the unconscious, waiting to be heard. Addiction speaks a language that is not logical, but deeply meaningful. It tells us that something is wounded within, something is out of balance, something that longs not to be punished, but to be understood, not to excuse what is destructive, but to reveal where it began, and through that revelation, to begin the work of healing. To see addiction in this light is not to romanticize it. It is not naive or idealistic. It is radically human. Because it sees the person behind the pain, the story behind the habit, the symbol behind the craving, and within that symbol, a possibility. Jung reminds us that what wounds us most deeply can also be what transforms us most completely, if we learn to listen with compassion. Addiction, then, is not only a prison, it is also a compass. Distorted, yes, but still pointing to something real, an unmet need, an unacknowledged truth, a thirst for meaning that has yet to be quenched. And this thirst must not be silenced. It must be understood. It must be channeled. Because only when a person discovers what they truly seek, only when they name their longing, can they begin to release the thing that enslaves them. Rarely does someone turn to addiction with full awareness. They don't sit down and plan their descent. They don't consciously choose to return, again and again, to the same darkness that haunts them. Instead, it is as if a part of them takes over, a hidden part, a silent force that pulls them back into the same loop. This part, dwelling deep within the unconscious, Jung called the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is not a monster. It is everything within us that we have disowned. All the impulses, emotions, and memories we've buried to be accepted, to survive, to belong. The anger we weren't allowed to feel, the grief we were told to ignore, the desires we were taught to shame. To confront the shadow is to face the truth of who we are. Not just the light, but the darkness too. And perhaps this is what the addict is unconsciously trying to do. To feel something real, to touch something true, even if only for a moment, even if it hurts. But what is repressed never truly disappears. It simply changes form. When pain is buried, it doesn't die. It waits. And when it is not brought into the light of awareness, it seeks other ways to emerge. One of those ways is addiction. At its root, addiction is not the problem itself. It is the symptom of an inner war, a war between two parts of the self. One part craves control, recognition, success. The other, hidden in the shadows, carries the wounds, the unspoken grief, the repressed anger, the silent sorrow. Rather than face this inner divide, the addict tries to silence it. They seek relief in something outside of themselves, a temporary balm for the ache they cannot name. But the shadow does not vanish when ignored. It grows stronger. It returns in moments of weakness, in sudden impulses, in choices that sabotage the very things they value most. The tragedy is this. Many do not even realize they are at war with themselves. They believe the enemy is out there. The drug, the drink, the screen, the temptation. But the true battle is within. One part longs to release the buried pain. Another part fears it, condemns it, locks it away. This creates a chronic tension, an invisible anxiety that gnaws from the inside. And so, even when the addict stops using the substance, the emptiness remains. They feel restless, irritable, depressed, and they do not understand why. Because they've removed the symptom, but not the silence underneath it. They've cut the branch, but left the root untouched. Jung understood this well. The shadow that remains unacknowledged will always find expression. And if not through one addiction, then through another. From alcohol to ambition, from sex to control, from drugs to distraction. The form may change, but the pattern repeats. To truly heal is not to substitute one compulsion for another. It is to face what drives the compulsion in the first place. And this is no easy task. Integrating the shadow requires courage. It asks for honesty, for the willingness to look in the mirror with no filter, to sit with parts of yourself you were taught to fear, to accept what you once believed made you unworthy. This journey is not about blame. It is not about excusing harm. It is about understanding, because only through understanding can we interrupt the cycle at its root. When a person begins to walk this path, they stop viewing addiction as an enemy to be eradicated and start to see it as a message, a signal that something within is crying out to be seen, to be healed, to be integrated. This shift does not remove responsibility, it deepens it. For now, the task is not just to resist the substance, but to understand the self. And when the shadow is brought into the light, not denied, not judged, but faced with awareness, it loses its grip. The person is no longer its victim. They become its interpreter. And in that shift, something extraordinary begins. A new relationship with the self, where impulses no longer rule unchecked, and healing is no longer a distant hope, but a lived, unfolding reality. In many cases, addiction is not born in the present, but rooted in a past that was never fully faced. Memories of abandonment, abuse, humiliation, or silent neglect sink into the unconscious like stones beneath still water. They are not gone. They are simply waiting. The shadow becomes their keeper. And even when the mind forgets, the body remembers. The pain may be buried, but it still pulses beneath the surface, subtle, unspoken, and unresolved. Addiction, then, becomes an unconscious strategy, not a pursuit of pleasure, but an avoidance of reunion, a desperate attempt to stay one step ahead of the pain. But the further one runs, the more power that pain gathers. What remains hidden grows restless, and what cannot be integrated within begins to distort perception without. The addict begins to see betrayal in love, danger in intimacy, isolation in connection. The world starts to reflect the chaos they cannot yet confront inside. This projection intensifies the cycle. What is denied within is seen everywhere. And the more one fights ghosts on the outside, the more distant they become from the healing they truly need. But this is not just a psychological process. It is a spiritual one. To face the shadow is not simply to analyze behavior. It is to surrender. It is to open oneself to the deeper truth, that within every human being exists both light and darkness, and both are essential for the soul to become whole. Addiction no longer appears as a curse when we begin to see it for what it truly is, a summons, an invitation to know oneself beyond the mass, beyond the roles, beneath the noise. And that kind of knowing cannot be given by another. No advice, no technique, no quick solution can replace the slow, sacred work of inner discovery. True transformation begins not when we avoid the darkness, but when we enter it, carefully, consciously, with humility and open eyes. Not to dwell there forever, but to listen, to learn, to recover what was lost. The shadow is not a wall to break through, but a landscape to explore. Jung said, "The gold is in the shadow," and he meant this. What you repress is not only your pain, but also your power. There, in the rejected corners of the self, live the real emotions, the buried creativity, the raw sensitivity, the silenced strength. To integrate the shadow is to bring those exiled parts home, to welcome what was once feared, to become whole again. And in doing so, the addict no longer sees themselves as broken, but as someone being reshaped by the fire of transformation. The wound they carry stops being a mark of shame and becomes a door to wisdom. The path is not straight, it is not easy, but it becomes meaningful when walked with honesty, with patience, and with compassion. Because beneath every addiction is not just a habit, but a hidden need, waiting to be understood. And once that need is seen clearly, everything can begin to change. And in that deeper seeing, a new way of being quietly begins to emerge. Jung observed that those who suffered most were not always searching for explanation, but for revelation. Not more facts, but a moment. A symbolic experience powerful enough to reorder their entire vision of life. Not to understand the past analytically, but to reconcile with it. To find once more a center within themselves. A place untouched by chaos, yet born through it. This reconciliation doesn't require dogma. It doesn't demand religious obedience, but it does ask for something sacred, a genuine spiritual encounter, not necessarily with God, but with meaning, with a sense of the eternal within the self. And this spiritual dimension, Jung insisted, is not a luxury, it is a necessity. Without it, the soul fragments. He saw this again and again in his patients. Those who could not connect with the sacred in any form were bound to repeat their symptoms endlessly, not because they lacked strength, but because they lacked a reason powerful enough to make transformation worth it. Addiction in many ways is the soul's misguided attempt to touch the divine, to dissolve the ego, to escape fragmentation, to feel, if only for a moment, whole. But substances cannot complete that journey. They imitate transcendence while leading only deeper into disconnection. For real transformation to occur, a symbol must be found, or rather, it must arise. Not from logic, not from instruction, but from the depths of the soul, when the pain has been fully seen, fully held. Only then does the psyche unveil its map. Only then does the wound begin to speak in the language of meaning. Healing begins when what once seemed like broken roads start to reveal a direction, a path. Across all cultures, rituals, myths, and archetypes have existed for this very reason, to help the human being symbolically die to an old self and be reborn into something greater. The addict, in this light, does not simply need abstinence. They need death, not of the body, but of the image they have clung to. They must let go of who they believed they were to make space for who they are becoming. And that death, that rebirth, does not come through willpower alone. It comes through surrender. And in that surrender, symbols begin to speak. Dreams become messages. Visions become guides. Fire ceases to be just destruction and becomes purification. What once burned to harm now burns to cleanse. And in that sacred fire, a new self quietly begins to form. Darkness no longer appears only as a threat. It becomes a fertile ground, a silent womb where truth begins to take root. What once felt unbearable starts to shift, not into ease, but into possibility. Therapeutic or spiritual support may walk beside us, but it cannot walk for us. No guide, no doctrine, no system can summon the symbolic. It cannot be forced. It can only be invited. Through stillness, through surrender, through readiness. The real alchemy happens in silence, not when the world changes, but when the soul stops running and begins to listen. In that moment, what once seemed like a tale of failure begins to reveal its hidden form, a hero's journey. The pain doesn't vanish, but it transforms. It is no longer just a wound. It becomes a message, not a weight to carry, but a sign to follow. Suffering no longer demands to be eliminated. It calls to be integrated. Addiction, through this lens, is not merely an illness. It is a misdirected initiation, a failed but honest attempt at transformation, a desperate search for meaning that took a wrong turn. But the mistake does not diminish the longing. It dignifies it, because only the one who has broken knows what truly matters. Only the one who has been emptied can rebuild with truth. And when they rebuild, they do so with roots that reach deeper. In that soil of loss, a seed begins to grow. A symbol, not implanted, not imposed, but born from the very depths of their being. And when that symbol finds fertile ground, it grows with quiet, unstoppable power. It does not merely shift behavior, it reorients perception. The person no longer sees themselves as their wounds. They begin to recognize themselves as the one who survived them. They no longer seek to numb, but to feel, not to vanish, but to show up, fully. And that presence changes everything. What was once called suffering now reveals itself as initiation. The addict is no longer a passive figure trapped in an endless cycle. They become the protagonist of their own sacred transformation. In that journey, pain turns to wisdom. The shadow becomes an ally. And the symbolic, no longer just an idea, opens the door to a spirituality that is lived, not theorized. A spirituality found not in escape, but in the courage to face oneself and keep walking. A spirituality that does not deny the body, that does not flee the world, but steps deeper into it. Healing, then, is not a return, not a restoration of what once was. It is emergence, the quiet unfolding of something that did not exist before and could only be born because the soul walked through the abyss. The symbol is not decoration, it is a doorway, a threshold to a wider vision of life. It reorients perception, it gathers the scattered pieces of the self and binds them with meaning. In understanding themselves, the human being no longer rejects their story, but reconciles with it. Reconciles with their pain, with their shadow, and ultimately, with the possibility of inner freedom. When the symbol has taken root, life no longer circles around control or fear. It begins to breathe, to realign itself around presence. It's no longer about avoiding pain, but about learning how to dwell within it, with clarity, with awareness, with courage. The emptiness that once felt unbearable reveals itself as space, not a void, but a cradle, where something true can grow. Addiction, with all its suffering, becomes the misunderstood language of a soul longing to be heard. And when that longing is met with real listening, gentle, honest, without judgment, the need to escape begins to dissolve. The path to wholeness does not demand that we be perfect. It asks that we be honest, that we look within and resist the urge to turn away. Healing is not erasure. It is remembrance with understanding. It is recognizing that even our suffering carried a message, a seed of truth planted in silence. Jung did not offer prescriptions. He offered paths, not maps, but invitations, so that each person might find their own way. Because at its core, addiction is not just hunger for sensation, it is a plea for meaning, and every act of healing is a return to the mystery of being alive. Right there at the exact point where pain no longer demands explanation, freedom begins.